All right. Good morning, everyone. Lance Tarchioni here with you on Ask the Agronomist. Got Adam Henniger here with me in the Nutrient Studios here, South Macomb. So appreciate you being with us today. Happy Halloween for those of you who are Halloween celebrators. I am my costume today is I'm going as a man who can grow a beard, which I cannot, but I'm pretending I can. Jennifer says that we got to get it. If I'm going to keep the beard, we got to get a new picture for Ask the Agronomist, and that would be a good reason to get rid of the beard, actually, so I don't have to take another picture. But anyway, Adam and I are happy to be here with you this morning. Before I get started, this is kind of a non-agronomic thing, but today obviously is Halloween. In my life, today is I had an angel born on Devil's Day. So my middle child, my oldest daughter Audrey, who's a grad student at Iowa State in animal science, today is her birthday. So happy birthday, Audrey! Love you, and look forward to seeing you the next time you got time to come home and see old Dad. So. With that, we'll go ahead and kick things off here this morning. Always love your questions. Today's a great day for me. In addition to being Audrey's birthday, which is fun, we're doing Ask the Agronomist here this morning. Then I'm going to a dealer meeting, which I really enjoy talking with our dealers, and so that'll be great. And then after that, I've got an appointment with a good grower customer to talk about what he saw on his farm this year. So that's a really good day for me. That's three things that I love doing, and I, personally, I like to pack all my days with things that I love doing as much as I can, but can't always make that happen. So anyway, with that, we'll go ahead and kick things off here. I got a list of things I want to cover. Adam is adjusting the board so things are squared and centered. Still a big fat guy with a bad beard in front of the board. Can't do anything about that. But anyway, we'll touch on. I got a lot of stuff up here that I want to spend some time on, talking about things that impacted yield this year. And I know you can't read that very well from where you're setting, but we'll talk about that here in a minute. But let's start with weather. So we had a good shower last night in places. Adam and I were kind of comparing notes. I had a couple farms that caught close to an inch last night. You may have had less than that. Sounds like there's more coming, and some of the forecasted amounts by the end of the weekend have a lot of Illinois getting 2 or 3 inches of rain, which would be more rain than we've had since July. So if we get that kind of moisture, that would be great. I know it's going to slow things down as far as finishing up harvest. Might keep us out of the field putting on anhydrous for a few days. Nothing wrong with that. And I think getting some more moisture in the soil probably is good for these fall nitrogen applications that people are wanting to make. There has been, as you go north, there's been quite a bit of ammonia going on for the past, I'd say, week-ish. The last 2 days have been unseasonably warm. I know it's a little bit of a bad look to see, anhydrous tanks going through the field when it's 85 degrees out, but it's not going to stay 85 degrees. But our soil temperatures are probably a little warmer than ideal for fall nitrogen applications. But generally, when people are going now, they're counting on soil temperatures dropping soon, and the extended range forecast looks like that's going to happen. The dryness is a little bit of a concern. Anhydrous has a very strong affinity for water. That's why you don't want it anywhere near your eyes, because it'll suck all the moisture out of your eyeballs, and that's very damaging to the eye. So when you put anhydrous ammonia into the soil, it very quickly binds to water, and that kind of locks it into the soil. If there's not enough water there for it to bind to, it kind of hangs out in a gaseous phase and kind of hangs out in a form that might find its way up out of the soil. Some of the guys that are running, have been running this fall, have been going a little deeper just to make sure they're getting the moisture, make sure they're sealing things really good. But if it's really dry and it takes a little while for it to find enough moisture to kind of stabilize, you're probably going to lose some, because it's probably going to make its way out through the soil. So I guess be careful. If you've been running anhydrous, be careful that you've got enough moisture. any work ground's going to need a rain on it before you could put anhydrous on it, I would say, because that work ground's just not going to have any moisture left in it at all. But guys that have been running on untouched soybean stubble have told me that they were pleasantly surprised. There's pretty good moisture down there, 6-8 inches deep, was sealing fine. Those applications were going on well. They did comment that they were doing quite a bit of tillage for their customers and breaking shear bolts and that sort of stuff. So as you know, this ground is hard, and that's mainly because it's so dry. It's not necessarily compacted; it's just dry. And when soil gets dry, it gets hard, whether it's compacted or not. So I know rain will keep us out of the field for a few days, but we're going to need some moisture to get through the rest of the fall and start getting some recharge. And it has gotten just exceptionally dry, fire hazard kind of conditions for dryness. And, the residue is just blowing all over the place because it is powder dry. So frankly, I'm looking forward to getting some moisture. I know when to start fall anhydrous is always a little bit of a debate, and the environmental aspect of things say don't get in a rush, don't get in a hurry, don't put it on too early. We don't want to lose it. We want to be good stewards. At the same time, if you are counting on getting it done, at some point, this mild summer-like dry fall is going to turn into a cold, wet, nasty winter. And if you don't have your applications made by that time, you're going to have to either delay that to the spring, which personally, I'm not a fan of spring anhydrous. You can do it, but you get a lot of compaction from that. We don't often have great spring soil conditions, 6-8 inches deep. Sometimes you're crowding that planting date a little bit. Guys that prefer to use anhydrous don't really want to switch to liquid. Afraid they're going to pay a higher price for nitrogen, or they may just have some other preference for anhydrous. So people that like to do fall anhydrous, they like to get it done. And if you're going to get it all done, sometimes you got to start a little on the early side. Always use an inhibitor with those applications. And really the big concern with, losing nitrogen from a fall application is not losing it in the fall. It is having a warm fall that gives it time for the inhibitor to wear off and everything get converted to nitrate prior to spring. And that way, if we have a wet April, a wet May, a wet June, all of that fall nitrogen is in a losable form by spring. So, the dry, you're not going to lose nitrogen in a warm, dry soil in the fall. You're not going to lose nitrogen in a warm, wet soil in the fall because it hasn't converted to nitrate yet. But once it gets converted to nitrate, you could lose a significant portion of it in a warm, wet spring. And if you're delaying those fall applications and using inhibitors and keeping some of that nitrogen, in a non-nitrate form so that it's not losable longer into the spring, that's kind of the goal typically. So moisture is really the enemy more than temperature. Warm soils don't cause nitrogen to go anywhere. They help speed up the conversion of it to a losable form, but warm weather doesn't make it go anywhere. Wet weather is what makes it go somewhere. So in a well-tiled field, you're going to leach it to a tile line. It's going to end up someplace where nobody wants it. You don't want it because it's not helping your corn. Other people don't want it because it's impacting water quality somewhere. If it's a poorly drained, wet, saturated field, then we're going to denitrify that nitrogen as N2 gas up into the atmosphere, which isn't particularly hurting the atmosphere because it's mostly nitrogen anyway. But it's not helping your corn crop any. So just be aware that getting it done is not the only thing that's important in the fall. So I understand it's important. I understand that you don't like doing it in the spring. I understand that you don't like switching to a different form of nitrogen. At the same time, we need to be prudent with how we're applying nitrogen in the fall. And if it's too early, too warm, too dry, if those applications aren't going on good, you're better off to wait and hope that you get a better window of opportunity later in the year. There's been years that we could apply nitrogen in October, November, December, January, February, March. You could have applied nitrogen at some time to the soil really all winter long. I'm hoping that we have a good, hard, cold, old-fashioned 1970s winter this year myself. I want to kill some bugs. And that may mean that, if we get that kind of winter, you may not have opportunities in December, January, February, March to put on quote unquote fall nitrogen. So I understand the window is tight. I understand the window is limited. I understand there's lots of acres to cover. I understand you're trying to get the form of nitrogen that your customers prefer to use, enable them to use that. But I was with a grower earlier this week, and he made the comment, I'd rather start too early than not get it done. And I understand the sentiment, but there are situations where starting too early is actually worse than not getting it done. And I think sometimes we just think that nothing bad is going to happen if I'm a little too early. And keep in mind that bad things can possibly happen, from a nitrogen application that's too early, or we get the wrong kind of spring weather conditions. And, fall nitrogen typically works really well for us. There's some awfully good corn raised every year with fall nitrogen applications. There are other parts of the country that think we're crazy putting nitrogen on in the fall, and that's not a thing everywhere. Occasionally I run into people from other parts of the country that don't realize, how much of that we do here and how successful it is. And there's been research done to show that, there's not really more nitrogen lost from fall applications than there are from spring applications. And that's because the typical time we lose it is not in the fall. The time we lose it is in April, May, June, July. So we may apply it in the fall, but we're going to lose it, next summer or next spring if we do lose it. So anyway, enough on fall anhydrous. The other thing going on in the fall would be fall burn down. So I think we've talked about fall burn down the last 3 episodes. We are in prime time right now. Right now, after this rain, kind of wash some of the dust off stuff, settle the residue down, perk up those winter annual weeds. Right after this rain event would be a great time, as soon as field conditions allow, to get your fall burn down on. Really from now until mid-December, my opinion. Apologies to you retail guys that don't want some stupid agronomist telling your growers that it's okay to spray fall burn down in December, because I get it. When you got to winterize sprayers and that kind of stuff, it's a pain in the butt. But these winter annual weeds are pretty actively growing on a 40-degree sunny afternoon. So, you don't have to have a 70-degree day and sunshine to do a good thing with fall burn down. You don't have to have residuals to do a good thing with the fall burn down. What you need to do a good job with the fall burn down is kill the weeds that are there the day that you spray, because most of the weeds, most of the mare's tail, most of the henbit, most of the pennycress, most of the shepherd's purse, most of the chickweed, most of all of that stuff that's going to be there in April and May and make you wish that you'd done a fall burn down is already emerged in your field. They're little bitty. They might be hiding underneath the residue. They might be small enough that you can't tell what they are, but there's going to be very little of that stuff emerge, after Thanksgiving, let's say. And if you're going to try to do a non-residual fall burn down, you might want to delay that application a little bit later. If you're using residuals, you're green light, good to go now. You could have gone 2 or 3 weeks ago. Would have been fine. So the important thing is to do it. That's more important than when you do it and what you do it with. There are lots of options as far as timing goes. There's lots of options as far as what you can do. You can, spray straight 2,4-D if you want. It's not going to do as good a job as some other stuff, but it's going to be better than doing nothing. So don't talk yourself out of doing a fall burn down. because you think it costs too much, because the cheapest fall burn down you can do is still going to have benefits. Now, if you've got mare's tail, better have some dicamba in there. If you want some residual, there's lots of residual products you can use. Some residual products have rotation flexibility to corn and soybeans. Some do not. So pay attention to that. Some people like to use Princep in a head of corn in fall burn down. It's a great product, but you can't rotate soybeans if you do that. So if you're confident that your rotation is not going to change, well, then you can do whatever you want. If you're not confident about what your rotation is going to be, then you either need to use a product that can be used ahead of corn or soybeans, or just avoid long-lasting residuals. Maybe you could use dicamba, as a short residual, but stay away from the hard residual products that might restrict your crop rotation if you're not sure which way you're going to go next year. So let's talk a little fall fertilizer. So obviously there's been a lot of talk about how expensive phosphates are. There's guys that are thinking about, maybe cutting back phosphate applications, or maybe in some cases completely skipping phosphate applications. Relatively speaking, potash seems like a pretty good buy. So, I know on my farm, I'm probably going to use plenty of potash and look for opportunities that won't hurt my yield, to maybe save a little bit in the budget on phosphates. So how do you do that? Well, not doing a 2-year spread would be the first place to start. I like to spread every acre every year anyway, which I understand increases my application costs, but it is more efficient with your fertilizer. You can manage your fertilizer better. You get less fertilizer tie-up. You're going to lose less fertilizer. There's been research done to show that if you put the same amount of fertilizer on over a 10-year period every year versus every other year, so you're putting on twice as much, relatively speaking, in that 2-year spread, you put the same amount of nutrition on over that 10-year period, you will build your soil test more with those annual applications than you will the other year applications. So there are benefits to spreading every year. I think the benefits of that outweigh the extra application cost, and allows you to put fertilizer on for next year's crop. Or if you're doing what I do, you're replacing what you took off of this year's crop. That's the other reason I like to spread every year. I'm using removal rate spreading plus soil test. So I've got my soil test. I'm paying attention to the soil test. Once the soil tests are where I want them to be, then I just spread based on maintenance, to put back what this year's crop just removed. And I would suggest that with the yields that some of you have been telling me you achieved this year, you removed a buttload of fertilizer this year. Even if you're just doing a 1-year spread, removing what 90 bushel soybeans and 290 bushel corn removed is going to be quite a bit of fertilizer. Now, if you've got really good soil test levels, maybe you don't have to replace 100% of it. Maybe you can make a little bit of withdrawal from the bank account, which is kind of what you're doing. If you apply less than removal rates, you are going to mine that soil slowly over time. Now, if you're putting on 75% of removal rate, you're going to mine it very slowly. If you skip a year, you're going to mine it a lot faster. And you know this, that once you let those soil test levels drop, it takes a lot more of an investment to get them back up. So personally, if I've got good soil tests, I want to keep them. So I want to put on enough that I'm not mining my soil. And unless your soil, if you've got a P1 test of, that averages 80 across the field, well, and that's 80 pounds, 80 parts per million would be ridiculously high. That'd be about 160 pounds. So if you're at 60 plus pounds on a P1, which would be 30 plus parts per million on a P1, most research would indicate that that's enough for good yields. So if you're above that level, you can probably afford to, massage that application a little bit. If you're below that level, well, then just be aware that you're already maybe below the optimal level, which means you might want to consider doing some build-up applications some year when it's a little more affordable than it is right now. But you also need to think twice about cutting back this year because you're going to deplete that soil even more, which means you're going to need even more buildup in the future. So Dr. Belo has done a ton of work at U of I on soils that are pretty good testing soils that are still responding to fertilizer applications. So, just be aware that, yeah, it's easy to save money by cutting back on fertilizer applications, but it's also possible to reduce your yield if you do it the wrong way or do it too much. So just keep that in mind as you're making those decisions for what you're going to do this fall from a fertility standpoint. Okay, so I'm going to dive into kind of the meat of the program here this morning, and I don't know if I'm going to rewrite this so you can see it, or you're just going to listen to me as I talk through this list. But I made a list of, I didn't count them. There's about 12 things there ish, I would guess, and I've got 4 things over here that you probably can't read. These are 4 planting windows. So this is the early April planting window, and I'm going to define that as March to April. I don't know what, 12th?
Yeah.
13th? I don't know exactly when that window ended, but somewhere in there. We had some rain mid-April. So you could plant really early April if you wanted to. Most people didn't, unless you were in Adam's territory. You're going to say something, Adam?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I mean, the early planting window in my territory was the end of March till probably April 5th is what I would call the early, but 13th is what. The thing about that earliest planting window was the 5 days after planting. Like the last couple of days in March and the first couple of days in April, that period was so warm after that that it was honestly ideal.
Yeah, I mean, I could have made 5 planting windows. Right. I could have the ultra early, the early. I kind of combined the ultra early and the early. Yeah. Which for most of my geography, nobody had done anything yet at that time anyway. And then this mid-April window, this is what I'm calling prior to April 25th. Most of you on or about April 25th, it got really wet. And that weekend, my mom's birthday is April 26th. So I remember that weekend being exceptionally wet. On Sunday morning, when I was going to church, I had about 300 acres that was underwater, just in ponds. Monday, I still had 250 acres that was underwater in ponds. The ponds were so big, people couldn't believe, as dry as it was, why are these ponds here? But we had 3-4 inches of rain, came pretty hard, came pretty fast. Took a while for that to soak away. That happened like April 25th, 26th, 27th. That weekend was kind of awful, kind of hard on stuff. Then the first opportunity we had after that to get back in the field was kind of around Mother's Day weekend. And some of you stretch, by Mother's Day, it wasn't too bad. Some of you stretched that a couple days, like the Friday, Saturday before Mother's Day. People were rolling. Patience had been lost by that time, and it was time to plant corn. So we had a window here around Mother's Day. And then the last window was about, I'm going to say May, 16th through 22nd-ish. And that's the window I planted most of my crop in at home. And as you know, if you've watched the program before, I preach patience in corn planting. I'm not an early corn pusher, and I like to remind people that there's nothing wrong with planting corn the 10th of May, and it's often the best corn. So it's been a little bit of a hard year on me because it didn't turn out to be that way. So these are the kind of the 4 big planting windows that we had. And so my list here, if you can't read it, is planting conditions, stand establishment, the weather like 5 days after planting, the weather during grain fill, nitrogen availability, impact of foliar disease, impact of wind events, impact of the dry August, September, impact of crown rot, impact of aphids, and this last one is a little bit unique. It's harvest moisture. Harvest moisture doesn't necessarily correlate exactly to the planting date windows, but it certainly does correlate to performance and yield. And there's been a hell of a lot of 13, 14, 15% corn harvested this year. And there ain't no way that something harvested at 13, 14, 15% should be compared to something that got harvested at 25%. So we got to factor that in here somewhere too. And so what I kind of wanted to do was rate each planting window as far as how they were impacted by these stressors and events that happen throughout the season. So I would argue that the early April planting conditions were probably the best we had in a lot of cases. And the second best was this late May. I'm going to say the worst was probably Mother's Day. And second worst was that mid-April, which the planting conditions here were not awful. They were actually pretty good. It was more what happened right after you planted that ruined that one. So let's drop down here to what happened after planting. So as Adam commented, this one was good. This one was good. This one was not as good, and this one was awful. So from a stand establishment standpoint, these were easily our poorest corn stands. These were easily our second poorest corn stands. These were probably actually the best, and these were the second best. And I think when we get through all this, I haven't done this ahead of time. I'm doing this for the first time myself here live, so we'll see how this turns out. It's going to be like golf, low score wins. So when we get through all this, if you add up the totals of these columns, I think it's going to correlate nicely with where the best corn was. So let's keep going. So grain fill weather. So I would say grain fill weather was the best here. It was the worst here. And I think it just kind of goes right in order.
Yeah, I would agree.
Nitrogen availability. Worst here. Best here. I think these two, I'm going to say it kind of goes in order a little bit with just the same way grain fill weather.
Moisture availability.
Because moisture availability and nitrogen availability are pretty key. I do think that some of, we had a really wet July. So there were places in July that had over 10 inches of rain. And there were places in July that this thing suffered from ponding. And the stage of growth of your corn, when it ponds, makes a big difference. So I do think there was some variability there. So the impact of foliar disease. Now nothing had a lot of foliar disease. As you went south, we tended to have more, actually. But I would say this one was probably impacted the least. This one was impacted the most. And again, I'm going to say it just kind of goes in order. And the reason for that is the foliar disease kind of gets worse based on calendar date. And so when the foliar disease kind of started getting as bad enough to impact yield, this early planted corn was about 2 weeks from black layer. Kind of hard to hurt it much. This stuff down here was, early milk. It had a long way to go. So there was definitely a correlation there. Impact of wind events. I'm going to say again, least was here, most was here, and probably, again, probably kind of goes in order of planting date. These, this corn here it was kind of thin in some cases. We didn't have great stands in some of this. A lot of replanting in this. So I could have made another category of, where was the replant? The replant was also here and here, and not so much out here and here.
Right.
Okay, so impact of dry August, September, you can kind of guess that. This one's just going to go in order as well. impacted crown rot. So this is a little bit of a tricky one because really nothing was impacted significantly by crown rot. I'm going to say that, based on potential, it would go inverse. And I think this April corn was set up to have a lot of problems with crown rot. The thing is, the April corn had a really kind, gentle, favorable grain fill period. You can't raise the kind of corn that you raised from that early April planting date without a good grain fill period. And a good low stress grain fill period will save your crop from crown rot, even if the root system is pretty well infected with crown rot. Impact of aphids. This one is, I'm gonna deviate this time on this one. Well, actually, tell you what, I'm gonna deviate on crown rot too, because I don't really think anything was significantly impacted by crown rot. So I'm going to give this one a 2, and I'm going to give all 3 of these 1. So you shouldn't change the way you're rating halfway through your exercise. That's probably illegal. Shouldn't do that, but I'm calling an audible here.
This is conceptual, right?
That's right. That's right. Adam and I will talk about this afterwards, and we'll do it right next time. So the reason I thought about doing this is because of aphids, because this one's about a 10, but I'm gonna give it a 4. This one is a 3, and the first 2 are 1s. I don't know how many of you are Christian believers, but if you're familiar with the concept of the Passover, you put the blood on the doorway, and then the death passed over you. Aphids passed over any corn planted in April, and they sought out the stuff planted. And the later in May it was planted, the more attractive it looked to them. So aphids are a huge factor on what's going on with May corn. So I won't put a rating on harvest moisture because we already talked about that. We know that the highest yields are achieved with a harvest moisture somewhere 23% and above. Now, if you're above 32, that means you've probably got some corn kernels in the field and some ears in the field that aren't black layered yet. And corn that's not black layered yet is still growing. So you actually lose yield if you harvest it too wet because it's not done accumulating dry matter yet. So just editorial comment there. So if we add all these up really quick, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So that would total 11. This one, a little harder math here, 8, 11, 13, 17, 21, 23. Here we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's 24, 28, 29. And that poor May corn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 4s, 24 and 6 is 30, and 2 1s, 32. So I would say, again, back to our golf analogy, low score wins. So the early April corn scored 11. The late April corn scored a 23. The Mother's Day corn scored a 29. And the after Mother's Day corn in April scored a 32 in our, completely arbitrary rating system here. So the 11, 23, 29, 32, those numbers don't particularly mean anything, but I do think they do correlate to the performance of the corn. And the early April corn was unbeatable. I have said this is an exaggeration, but sometimes you exaggerate for effect. The worst corn in this planting window was better than the best corn in this planting window. There's a few exceptions to that, but not very many. Mid-May corn had no chance this year because of all this versus early April corn. And generally speaking, the later April corn also had no chance against the early April corn because it had replant in it. It had poor stands. It had holes. It had the well-drained parts of your field and the high parts of your field. It was just as good as this corn. But by the time you average in the replant and the pour stands and the holes, it came up short of this, but generally still ahead of this. So the differences that exist this year based on when you planted, based on your soil type, based on your drainage, based on your rainfall patterns, based on lots of things, are enormous. And part of the reason they're so enormous is because yields are so high. In low yield years, you don't see the variability that we're seeing this year because, you generally don't have 300 bushel corn. But this year we did. And so if you saw 300 bushel corn, I saw some 140, and I do this for a living, and I also farm. So, I know how good some of your corn was. And so I noticed when mine's kind of sucky, and I know some of you have been frustrated by, you heard people talking about how good their corn was, and you haven't found that on your farm. Well, if you planted a lot of corn in this window, I'm sorry, you're not going to find that on your farm. Now I would remind you that this window, the 2 prior years, was the best of all of them. And it could be again next year. I'm probably going to make that bet. I don't think we're going to have aphids next year. I don't, we might not have an August, September drought next year. Now some of you are starting to think that August, September droughts are just normal weather for us now. And we either got to plant earlier stuff or plant earlier or, do something so that the crop is pretty well made by the time we get into the August and September drought. And we can't be relying on a hurricane rain to come up and save us. So that trend of being too dry in August and September, that's if you look at normal rainfall amounts, August and September are 2 of the driest months, in the year on a 30-year average too. So we don't normally have wet August and wet Septembers. Those are kind of weird. But I really think this exercise explains a lot of the variability that we see. And then you factor in things like hybrid differences. You factor in things like, did you use fungicide or not? In Adam's territory, we had enough disease pressure come in late. He's actually seen some benefits to like an R3, R4 application. Now, my area, we didn't so much see that because the primary problem with that corn late season up here was not disease, it was drought. And fungicide can alleviate stress, but fungicide is not going to save you in a drought. So the impact of those late fungicide applications was different based on where you're at, disease pressure, disease timing, weather going on. But I just have a lot of the conversations I'm having with growers relate to something up here on this board.
Yeah, and I think it's just important to reiterate the fact that on the left side are the things that impact your yield. And it just so happens that this year, the timing of those things correlated this way with planting date.
Right.
And so many times people think of planting date as like the factor, the actual literal calendar date, as the factor that's influencing it. It's not.
Right.
It's what the weather events are given that calendar date that year. Right. And that's why you say that late planted corn has just as good a chance, and everybody's seen it in the last several years. It has just good a chance of being better than the early planted corn.
Well,
but it just wasn't this year.
Right. And often, you get, the reason late planted corn can compete with early planted corn are those 3 things.
Correct.
And
even that, I was gonna say, and this one too.
So, normally late planted corn, might have worse conditions for grain fill, might have poor nitrogen availability, might have bigger impact of foliar disease, might be more impacted by wind events, certainly going to be more impacted if it gets dry late. If we have aphids, going to be more impacted by aphids. But the fact that in a normal Illinois growing season, because of our soils, because of our rainfall, normally early planted corn is hamstrung by those 4 things. And the early planted corn is penalized by those 4 things more than the later planted corn is penalized by these 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 things. And when that happens, that's when your mid-May corn is beating your April 10th corn. But that's not the case this year. Could be, it will be different next year, I guarantee it. You know, we say this every year. Every year is different. And, you know, and every year we say it again as though it's something new, that every year is different. And it's not new, it's as old as time, that every year is different. And with all these variables, that's why every year is different, because you've got so many variables, and just changing one of them just a little bit by the weather, by the timing, by whatever, you know, kind of changes the whole view of things.
So a couple things, Lance. One, this is for corn, right? We didn't talk about
beans. Yeah. Although there'd be some similarities.
There would be some, absolutely right.
Yeah.
But I had a question come in from Mike, and you know, you circled down there at the bottom that you're about ready to erase the impact of crown rot.
Yep.
And he's wanting to know if red crown rot in soybean and crown rot in corn are kind of the next biggest challenges that we're facing in corn and soybean production in the Midwest here.
That's a hard question to answer, Mike, because as you move around geographically, people's opinions of what the boogeyman is changes a lot. So, you know, tar spot is probably broadly considered to be, you know, the next biggest threat in corn over crown rot. My opinion, in central Illinois, and certainly central Illinois south, year in and year out, I think we're more impacted by crown rot than we are by tar spot. There's also a correlation between those 2 diseases, because if you've got crown rot in your roots and you got tar spot killing your leaves, that is a deadly combination. And keeping your leaves alive will keep the crown rot at bay to a certain extent. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. I got people that think tar spot's causing crown rot, and I got people that think crown rot's causing tar spot. Neither one of them causes either one, but they definitely work together to mess up your corn. So the combination is not good, and any foliar disease will make crown rot worse. In 2021, it was southern rust more than tar spot that exacerbated our crown rot problem. So red crown rot in soybeans, and I'll call it generic. And there is no disease called crown rot in corn. There's fusarium crown rot. There's red root rot. We throw a lot. You know, crown rot is a condition in corn, I would say, caused by many different pathogens. So there is not a specific pathogen that's causing crown rot in corn. There's multiple pathogens working together to cause what we call crown rot in corn. Fusarium gets talked about the most. I don't know that it's even the most important, but it is the one that gets associated with the disease the most. They're totally different pathogens. They're totally different diseases. They don't necessarily correlate. I think there are some similarities. I think planting date affects them both. I don't think soil type affects red crown rot as much as it does crown rot in corn, because I think you've seen some some lighter soil have red crown rot in soybeans. Right. I mean, crown rot in corn typically is a dark black, high organic matter, high fertility soil problem. Red crown rot in soybeans, I'm not sure it's quite as limited in its soils that it likes. I'm not aware of another emerging disease in soybeans that has the potential to be more devastating than red crown rot. Right now today, white mold's a bigger deal. Sudden death syndrome is a bigger deal. Other diseases are a bigger deal. The biggest disease issues this year in soybeans, in my opinion, were none of the diseases that we've been talking about here lately. It was more some of the stress-induced diseases that killed the plants prematurely. Things like stem canker, things like pod and stem blight, things like zone lines, things like charcoal rot, things like anthracnose, diseases that you don't go through seed guides picking varieties because of zone lines or pod and stem blight. But every bad spot in a bean field that I looked at this fall, where the beans were lodged and dark, and you could see they just died because all the leaves were hanging up in the canopy, and you could just tell the thing didn't turn and drop its leaves, turn yellow and let the leaves fall off. Oh, look at how pretty that yellow bean is. It just turned brown and died. Those other secondary, the pathologists would call them secondary diseases. They typically only impact the soybean under stress. Why was the soybean under stress? Because it didn't rain in August is why the soybean was under stress. And again, the early planted beans, they were damn near done before it got dry. So they weren't under as much stress. I've seen fields where poor stands or thin stands were way better than where you had a good full stand. I think a thin stand was less stressed as well because you had less biomass there to keep alive. And so being a little on the thin side was good this year in soybeans because it limited your stress. So, some people would argue tar spot. Some people would argue crown rot. There's new and emerging things that I can't remember what it's called, but there's another new one that we found this year. There's always stuff out there. For some people would say some of the ear molds, like gibberella ear rot. There's parts of the country that probably the biggest issue they have with corn is gib, because they're raising corn that they can't sell because of toxins in the grain, and that's kind of a big deal. So when diplodia was bad for us, it always frustrated me that I could not get universal agreement amongst agronomists within Bayer, DeKalb, Monsanto that diplodia was the biggest threat we had to corn. For a few years there, it kind of seemed to us in Central Illinois like it was, but other parts of the country, they don't even know what diplodia is. So all these different pathogens vary, and of course, Central Illinois, we think, well, who's more important than Central Illinois? Ask somebody in Iowa, they'll tell you, well, Iowa is more important than Central Illinois. So everybody thinks that where they grow corn is the most important corn growing place in the world. Unless maybe you're from Missouri. If you're Missouri, unfortunately, you recognize you're not in the most important corn growing place in the world. So anyway, I'm picking on my Missouri friends. So good question. Hard to answer. I don't really think there is an answer to that question because it kind of depends on where you're at and based on your experience, what's been the biggest problem that you've had. But I agree. Crown rot is a very insidious beast, and we are focused a lot on improving our genetic resistance to crown rot, looking for treatments that will do something to crown rot. Hard to find those, but there's certainly an answer that lies in genetics. And then red crown rot in soybeans, that's probably going to get solved genetically as well. These soil pathogens, you can't really eradicate the pathogen. You can't, it's even hard chemically to protect the plant from the pathogen. It's easier to protect the plant genetically from the pathogen, but that takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort in breeding programs. You got to identify a source of resistance. And then once you've identified a source of resistance, you've got to get it bred into your high yielding germplasm. Or what you end up with is resistant crappy beans that you don't want to plant. Because the challenge with all these products is on the acres impacted by them, they are devastating. But if only 10% of the acres are getting devastated, how much yield do you want to give up on 100% of your acres to protect the 10% that's being devastated by a disease? So it's disease resistance is easy to breed for. High yielding disease resistance is what the tricky thing is. And so that's why it takes sometimes a long time, sometimes longer than you would like, to get disease resistance in the kind of stuff that you want to grow. Appreciate the question, Mike. Sorry for my crappy answer. Anything else coming in, Adam?
No, pretty quiet otherwise.
Okay, so when's what's 2 weeks? Is that like the 13th of November?
2 weeks would be the 14th.
14th of November. Okay, so November 14th will be our next episode. I'll give Jennifer a plug on Yield Chasers. So remember, get your Yield Chaser entries in. We got in trouble 2 weeks ago because we got the date wrong. It was December 10th.
You're gonna hit me again.
We got. I know you and I got a text with her.
Yeah,
it was capital letters. I think that meant she was yelling at us because we got the date wrong.
I think that's right.
So sometime in mid-December is the deadline to get your Yield Chaser entry in. So don't dilly-dally. Get that done if you're out of the field here for a couple days.
December 10th.
December 10th. I was pretty sure it wasn't the 15th. I think we said the 15th last time, and naughty. We were wrong. So December 10th is the deadline for Yield Chaser entries. Get those in, especially a little tip. If you were planting corn and beans before April 10th, you can find some good stuff to enter. If you weren't planting corn and soybeans before April 10th, please still enter the contest. You might not win. It's still fun. We'll have a good banquet. We'll have a really good steak. We'll have a good meal. We'll have some good speakers. Cal and I'll be there too. We're not in the good speaker category, but we'll be there.
Some sweet prizes.
Yeah, great prizes. Yep. I don't know what we're doing for prizes this year, but they'll be nice. And then also, I still haven't gotten a hold of Dr. Belo to get nailed down what our date is for our season-ending episode. And I hope he hasn't changed his mind because I've name dropped him twice now that he'll be with me. We got to get that set up too. But sometime in December will be our year-end episode. We'll have a prize of some kind for that as well. And I'm already looking forward to. It's always fun with Dr. Belo. So. Thanks for joining today. Appreciate the question. And we'll be back again with you in 2 weeks. Everybody stay safe. Take care.